Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser, and I'm here to tell you that we are living in a post-industrial cargo cult. What's a cargo cult, you ask? According to Wikipedia, a cargo cult is a religious practice that has appeared in many traditional pre-industrial tribal societies in the wake of interaction with technologically advanced cultures. The cults focus on obtaining the material wealth, i.e. the cargo, of the advanced culture through magic and religious rituals and practices. Kind of like pressing Control print. Today we are all post-industrial cargo in a cult called Keynesianism. The ritual act of printing money itself, we are told by our cult leaders like Jim Jones and his Kool-Aid, Ben Bernanke and his printing, will lead to a future of material wealth and prosperity for all. All on board the Hale-Bopp comet, maybe. And it is banking transactions at an ever-increasing rate which mimic a real booming economy in which real businesses are being built and growing that we are told will boost our GDP. And as rich societies consume many goods, our cult leaders say, go shopping, because surely then we will all become rich. And so we eat and consume, we consume housing, and we have bubbles and housing, and bond bubbles, and equity bubbles, and tech bubbles, and green bubbles. Eat and consume, transact and print. But the cargo, that never actually gets here. Stacey?
Yes, Max. Now everybody knows we've deindustrialized, so we're post-industrial, and just look at Detroit. And we seem to have forgotten how it is that we built these big economies, how we made these airplanes and sent men to the moon, how we were able to create these. And like we saw in the Pacific Islands, there was a lot of cargo cult activity there, because during the World War II, all these Japanese and U.S. military bases were established there. And the tribes there saw all these planes coming in, and the planes brought with them all sorts of material wealth, cargo. And in an attempt to attract further deliveries of goods once the war ended, followers of the cults in these Pacific Islands engaged in ritualistic practices such as building crude imitation landing strips, aircraft and radio equipment, and mimicking the behavior that they had observed of the military personnel operating them. So the islanders began concocting headphones made out of coconuts, and they would sit up in a sort of fabricated control tower. They would also wave the landing signals while standing on these crude runways that they had built. So they would be waving to planes that weren't there, but thought by the act of doing that, the plane would deliver some cargo, material wealth to them.
Okay, so we're in a post-industrial society where money printing is not creating any growth. We've had trillions, tens of trillions of new dollars and yen and euros printed over the past few years, but there hasn't been any sustainable or meaningful GDP growth. However, the people in charge, like the cargo cult people, they mimic the actions from when it did work. It used to work that if you hit the print button, it used to generate some GDP growth, but it doesn't work anymore. But it doesn't stop them from, like a mad cult, continuing to mimic what those actions that seem to be correlated to GDP growth.
Well, it was a little bit the opposite. The GDP growth came first. We were building things, we were manufacturing, we were creating wealth. And because of that, there was a demand for more currency to keep the system operating. So they remember that they had to print a lot of money, that the money supply was booming along with the economy. And now they only remember that there was a lot of money. Maybe that's the answer. If we keep on printing money, then the wealth creation will come afterward.
Right, so it's cognitive dissonance, isn't it? And if they were going to mimic an action to generate real wealth, they would maybe do this, which is sewing. Or they would do this, manufacturing something at the metal printing factory. But no, they do this, and this is money printing, which is not generating any growth, and they don't understand why, because they don't understand they don't know how to manufacture anymore in the UK or in the US. They don't know what it means. They don't know where shoes come from. They don't know that there used to be a place called a factory where you made a shoe and the person making the shoe got a wage, and that created capital that created something called free market capitalism. They don't know anything about that anymore. They just see goods arriving at the shops. They just use debt and credit cards to buy those things, and to get more of that debt into their system to buy more stuff, they mimic the central banker who's just doing like a cargo cult. They're mimicking an action. Oh, you know, do this, do this.
So at every level, whether it's government, individual, or corporate or banking sector, we all do behave in this way where we're putting like coconut earphones on and sitting up in a fabricated control tower, and that is supposed to make us wealthy, whether we're participating in a housing bubble or printing at the central bank or transacting. Remember, for the banking sector, they think that just transacting, because there were a lot of transaction when there was a lot of real deals and business and things happening.
We saw that with Mark Carney. He was testifying at the Treasury Select Committee here in the UK recently, and they asked him, what about this economy? How do we get things going? And like a part of a cargo cult, you know, he put on the coconut heads and he started making gestures like bring in the cargo planes and doing incantations like a witch doctor. And of course, the people who were asking him questions were like, that's fantastic. When do we get the stuff? When do we get the goods? And he kept mimicking these arcane, symbolic gestures that are not tied to anything having to do with a real economy.
And here we have a headline from Lord Adair Turner, who is the outgoing head of the Financial Services Authority. So here's one headline on that level. Lord Turner lets the cat out of the bag. Print money to fund spending. Lord Turner, the departing chairman of the Financial Services Authority, has defended financing government spending by printing money, arguing that within limits, it absolutely definitively does not lead to inflation.
Yeah, I read a story in the Telegraph that gave a history of governments that have resorted to printing money to stimulate growth. Did it lead to inflation? They had 5 examples. In 4 out of the 5 examples, it led to either high or hyperinflation, with the exception being the U.S. after World War II. But of course, they had the world reserve currency that just won World War II, and there was a gold standard. So you can't even include that in the examples. But in all the other examples, it most definitely did lead to higher inflation, and in some cases hyperinflation. We already see it here in the UK. The real inflation here is now just around 8% for people who are shopping in the high street for food and energy, not the 2.7% that the government erroneously reports.
So now we go to the normal human individual, the participant in the economy. They are in a post-industrial economy. They forgot how to create wealth, how to make a living. So they're out there on the runway with their fake signals, hoping that, and this is the act of using credit cards, right? Because they don't have jobs. Since 1971, jobs have plummeted, real income and wealth have plummeted in the United States.
It's not the return of disco.
No.
No. This is a cargo cult.
Yeah.
Symbolic message of degradation. If it was disco, we could hope for real, genuine inflation, because back in the 70s, yeah, that was when you actually had inflation.
Well, the United States of debt addiction, $16.7 trillion. That is our current national debt. $12.8 trillion. That is the amount households carry in mortgage and consumer debt. We are now addicted to debt to lubricate the wheels of our financial system. There is nothing wrong with debt per se, but it is safe to say that too much debt relative to how much revenue is being produced is a sign of economic problems. Again, you know, back during World War II, during these original cargo cults, we had a lot of debt, government debt, but it was going into building goods and services and infrastructure. And now it's just, we've got rid of all that, the things that might lead to wealth production eventually. Instead, we just have the debt, and we think accumulating the debt will somehow make us wealthy.
Right. I mean, it's the idea of, do we need more aggregate demand, or do we need some aggregate supply? So the Keynesians out there believe that it's all about aggregate demand, because 70% of the economy is consumption. So we need to stoke consumption with cheaper rates. But without supply, stuff that's being manufactured for wages that would foster savings would be, of course, the backbone of a capital. So you can't have capitalism without capital. Then if everyone's trying to aggregate demand from each other, you end up with what we have now, which is a currency war.
Well, you mentioned the savings, and one thing that Ben Bernanke, who calls himself a student of the Great Depression, when they look back, these cargo cultists in the central banks look back at the Great Depression, they see that savings rates went up really high, and they think savings causes deflation. So they think that if we target the savings, if we make savings bad, then it'll disappear, and then we'll have a miracle economy. The system is now set up to punish any type of savings. Good luck trying to stash your money in a bank account and outrun even the steady pace of inflation. Take a look at the current savings rate for Bank of America. And there you see 0.01%.
Well, they're self-hating capitalists. They're not socialists, per se, although you would think that they were because the banks live on welfare. And handouts from the state. And there's no price discovery, and it's all fixed. But it's not really about socialism so much as being a self-hating capitalist. They like the idea of capitalism, but they don't want to actually work to generate the savings to be a capitalist. They just want to buy, they want to live large, they want to live like a rich capitalist, but they just never want to work.
Well, it's a cargo cultist. You can't even call it capitalism because they don't know what the ingredients
It's gone
are.
beyond the working
they know how
thing.
to act like we were capitalists. We used to be capitalists, and they know how to act like it.
It's post-industrial, post-work. It's not even about work. It's not about faking. It's not about, I don't want to work, I just want stuff. It's about, I want to do a magic dance, and I want stuff.
Yeah, it's just like the Pacific Islanders who saw magically these men arrive in big cargo planes, and all sorts of canned foods and goods and stuff happened, and they thought it was that action of the guy on the runway that brought it.
So the connection between work and savings and stuff is completely severed.
Gone.
It's completely gone now.
There are also the banks operating and the corporations operating on this whole level of islanders not uncertain where the wealth came from. Did securitization lead to riskier corporate lending? This is Yao Santos, vice president in the Research and Statistics Group of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Their research showed that during the boom years of securitization, corporate loans that banks securitized at loan origination underperformed similar unsecuritized loans originated by the same banks. Additionally, we report evidence suggesting that the performance gap reflects looser underwriting standards applied by the banks they securitize. And what they found that they moved to an originate to distribute model from an originate to hold model, and therefore all the standards went out and then they forgot because they just thought securitization, this act of securitization was creating wealth.
Right. Before the 1987 crash, there was a man named Mike Milken who came up with the idea of original junk. You don't need to originate an A-rated bond and wait for it to fall into junk. Just sell junk from the get-go. This created a Ponzi scheme that led to the 1987 stock market crash of 22%. And I was working on Wall Street at the time, and I have to laugh when I see people refer to a 1% move down in the stock market as being, a crash on the Dow Jones. It's down 1%. Try living through a 22% crash, as I did. That's a crash, okay? That's a real crash for men, not you wusses. Stacey Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, stay tuned for the second half. I'll be speaking with Sandeep Jaitley, who is definitely not a member of the Keynesian cargo cult. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Sandeep Jaitley of FiketaResearch.com. Sandeep, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Thanks very much, Max.
All right, Sandeep, the big news in town. Mark Carney, he was at the Bank of Canada. Now he's going to be running the Bank of England. Your thoughts?
I haven't really given much thought to a new governor of the Bank of England. He's been quite evasive in what he's going to be attempting to be doing. But he seems to be of the currency debasement kind of philosophy.
Okay, before we get into currency debasement, let's kind of put this into a broader context, because these days people need to have a signal in terms of what school they're from. And in the case of yourself, okay, you're broadly speaking an Austrian economist.
Sure.
And Mark Carney, I think, it's hard to put him into, let's say, a school, but he's definitely from a neoliberal Chicago school, Milton Friedman type of economist who believes in the sanctity of economics as a hard science. And let me ask you this thought. He uses a term, for example, that the UK economy needs to achieve escape velocity. Now, I think I know what he means by that, but escape velocity is a term from physics. It has a very specific meaning. There's an algorithm for a rocket to achieve escape velocity.
Yeah.
Isn't this another example of an economist trying to sound like he knows what the hell he's talking about?
Absolutely. I can't disagree with that. I mean, what on earth does escape velocity mean in the context of economics? It doesn't mean anything.
I think what he's trying to say is that the economy needs to grow, and to grow the economy, we need to print more money, and we're willing to sacrifice the risk of having any inflation to create this growth. But the problem is that we've had 30 years of this thinking, and every single year, from Reagan Thatcher onward, the amount of debt it's required to create 1 unit of growth has been ever increasing, almost exponentially. So we're at a point of hyperinflation.
Well, they don't know what to do that's different, so they have to portray it in a different way. So all of this management speak, all of this kind of this nonsense speak, I call it, is just hiding the fact that they're doing the same old stuff that they, as you said, they've been doing for the past 30 years, more.
I want to ask you about schools of economics. Austrian School of Economics, they do a lot of work in describing the credit cycle, which leads ultimately to failure. And this is very similar to what Hyman Minsky describes in his work, and he was very active in the 70s and 80s. Is there a connection between Minsky and the Austrian School, and is that a good model to look at in terms of where we are with this money printing and possible debt collapse?
The Austrian business cycle theory, as it's portrayed to everyone who would be watching the show, for example, is that you extend credit too much, whatever that means, and you get the retraction afterwards. Now, there's no limit to the volume of credit that an economy can handle. What happens is when you layer that credit incorrectly, in the sense of lending out short-term money on a longer-term basis, so for example, if you've got a 4-year mortgage, you're actually, that's being financed on at most 1-year money. So every time a year comes up, you have to refinance the mortgage. But the actual maturity of that mortgage is much longer than any of the duration of any of the funds that's being used to fund it.
All right, let me jump in, because you're describing what some would call a problem of duration risk. And in the case of central banks, they've got a lot of debt on their books. They say they can unwind. Bernanke says he can unwind in 15 minutes. But during these past few years, they've changed the composure of the debts on their books so that they are now of different maturities than they were a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago. And in fact, it's not the same debt on the way out as it is on the way in.
No, of course.
And I would use it in the analogy of if you were to swallow whole a porcupine, the quills are facing out as you swallow. So it goes down relatively easily if you're trying to swallow a porcupine. But then pulling it out, the quills are now going the wrong direction, and that's your duration risk. I realize it's a bit of a poetic attempt to describe this, but how would you build on that?
The problem with our economy, apart from fiat credit, is the fact that we don't match maturities of assets and liabilities properly. So that's exactly that. So when they say, oh, we're just going to keep the balance sheet at a steady 350 billion, it implies that there's no flux going on there. But you've got bonds expiring, and they'll need to, by definition, reinvest those proceeds. Otherwise, the balance sheet will shrink. So to say that we're going to keep it at a constant level, oh, and then we're doing this thing where we're selling our short-term bonds and buying, well, you have to do that. You have to keep on pushing out the time. Because if you own, let's say, a 5-year bond, if you own £1 billion worth of bonds with a 5-year maturity, but you want to keep them for 10 years, you're going to be in a quandary at some point. What do? You'll have to create £5 billion worth, £1 billion worth of bonds at that expiry just to keep this whole charade going.
Okay, so we're describing that the Fed takes on a lot of debts, and then they essentially process those debts in a debt processor called the Federal Reserve Bank, and they turn into something very different than what they started at. And the idea of exiting is vastly more complicated than we are led to believe. Now, the way this shows up kind of in the, let's say, the economy that people see, the visible economy, is that, of course, these debts overlap to a great degree the bonds that are held on various banks' balance sheets. And these bonds on various banks' balance sheets are priced at par. They're held in the books at 100 cents on the dollar.
Yeah.
But if we're saying that the credit on the Fed's books is impaired, and in fact it's nowhere near what they say it is, then pari passu, to use a banking term, with that statement, we can say that the bank's bonds on their balance sheet is equally impaired, and that the problem with letting the debts on the Fed's or the Bank of England's books expire, disappear, is that you have a mirror effect in the banking sector, which then will have to come clean and say, you know what, our book value is not what we say it is, our balance sheet is not what we say it is, we are in fact technically insolvent, our stock shouldn't be worth 160 billion like JP Morgan, it should be worth 0.
You're right. I mean, they're not going to unwind this scheme for a very long time. I think of the order at least another 5 more years, if not a decade.
Now we already see in the UK prices moving up for stuff that people buy. When they go to the shops, food, energy, education, these are moving up. At what point do you have a situation where the inflation, even if you substitute horse meat for cow meat and sell it at the same price, it becomes so outrageous that, you know, in this country, they had the poll tax riots not too long ago. And people, they went out on the street and they rioted seriously. Remember, you have it in you, British people. You can do it if you think, you know, if you try. Poll tax riots were an example of something good, not bad. But what about this inflation? Is it going to...
Well, I mean, you have to think about the median person and what the median person consumes. And if you look at and generalizing here obviously, but the median, what the median person consumes, you're not sort of seeing this 10% per annum price rise yet. I mean, a McDonald's Happy Meal hasn't gone up 10% on the year before.
Okay, but let's we'll get back to that in a second. But let's look at McDonald's for a second, because they just announced they're hiring 2,500 new employees in the UK. At the same time, a very high-end investment bank is laying off 1,000 employees. Those 1,000 employees were making probably 5 to 10 times at least more than the McDonald's worker. Now, on one hand, you can say, well, you've got more jobs, and the government says this all the time. We have more jobs in this economy. David Cameron in the House of Commons will say, oh, 1 million more jobs. But they're minimum wage jobs, or they're temporary jobs, or part-time jobs. Do these part-time minimum wage jobs generate enough taxable income to make a dent in the outstanding debt of this country?
No, I would imagine, this is a part of a whole shift to becoming a servile economy. You know, if you don't do anything yourself, then you have to be a servant to someone who does something.
Okay, let's get back to the other question about inflation for a second. The experience of people on the high streets is different than 2% annualized inflation. They are buying, obviously, in the forecourts of the petrol stations, they're buying petrol at a higher price that's gone up considerably over the past few years. The government doesn't really include that in their RPI calculations. Price of food, there's a lot of substitution going on. They're substituting, let's say, again, I don't want to beat the dead horse, but they're replacing beef with dead horses because it's cheaper. That's inflation. We saw the same thing during Roman times when they clipped the coins. That's inflation.
Well, they're changing the composition of the basket to suit their ends.
Okay, so you were saying a moment ago that the average person doesn't experience a higher inflation.
No. They wouldn't, let's say, be experiencing education fees going up sort of 10-15% year on year. They're obviously experiencing it, but they're not experiencing it to the degree that other people might be experiencing it. But there will be a point, there has to be a point where, I hope there's a point, where they do stop and say, well, what the hell are we doing?
Well, I think, if I may, I think what you're saying is it's becoming normalized.
It is becoming normalized.
So they're becoming desensitized to this deflation. Okay, we got 20 seconds to go. Let's talk currency wars. Let's talk Japan. They've obviously debased. And the China and Korea are pissed off about it. And they're actually getting, it looks like they're in a war, on a war footing. Japan, you know, these two, they don't like each other. So Japan is saying, F you, we're taking our yen down. Some are positing that Japan will be the first into the currency debasement vortex of hyperinflation.
The Japanese mindset isn't to cause that kind of problem.
But they're kamikazes. I mean, not to
They
say that
are.
they're all kamikazes. I don't want to make that assertion.
In
that
attitude,
Japanese
yes.
people equals kamikaze. But we're the suicide bombers and warriors that come. The kamikaze is a Japanese word. Push comes to shove, they will kamikaze currency themselves.
You've got a very deferential society in Japan. So if the population felt that they wanted to get rid of their yen, that is just, in hyperinflation, you just want to exchange your currencies as quickly as you have them. I don't...
Strap on the headband with the big red dot and go fly your currency into the Pacific Ocean, because that's the only way you're going to get out of this mess. All right, Sandeep Jaitley, we're out of time. Thanks for being on the Keiser Report.
Thanks, mate.
All right, that's all the time we have for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank my guest, Sandeep Jaitley of Faketa Research. If you'd like to contact us, please tweet us at Keiser Report or at facebook.com/Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.